Yes, thank you, Raj. It's such an absolute pleasure and honor to be invited to speak to all of you. As in my talk, you will see like how influential going to IDC has been for what I do today in my career. So it's just a pleasure to be, um, to be here. It's morning. It's raining here in Arizona, which is very rare for it to be raining. So it's nice because otherwise it gets pretty hot. Without further ado, I'm going to start my presentation. Let's see if this works. We had tested it. It had worked. Can you see just one screen, or do you see two screens or three screens or whatever?
We see one. It's
All
fine.
right, thank you. So I want to talk about this idea of bringing design into education. And at any point, feel free to interrupt, ask questions, whatever. This is quite, I can't see all of you, so just raise your voice and speak. So anyway, so I'm currently Associate Dean of Scholarship and Innovation at the Maryland Fulton Teachers College. This is my contact information, pretty much Punya Mishra, wherever. So it's punyamishra.com if you want to know more about the work that I do. Just quickly, my background. I have an undergraduate degree in engineering from BITS Pilani, ended up in IDC, wanting to make educational film. But I've always been sort of interested in education, so got my PhD in education. So I've done a lot of work in educational technology around creativity, teacher education. And now I think the way I call myself really is an educational systems designer. So the design thing has been a thread consistently, and then, of course, deep IDC connection in the sense that met my wife Smita there, and so we have two kids. So there's a IDC features big in our lives in some ways, right? So to set the stage for sort of a bigger conversation around design, I want to go back to like February 2020, when we first heard of COVID. And at that time, just a couple of countries had their schools closed down, but within pretty much 2 months, the entire globe, 194 countries and 1.6 billion learners were out of school and doing what is known as remote learning. And in some ways, it was an unprecedented sort of global educational social experiment whose impact, continues even today when people talk about learning loss, talk about online, talk about this, talk about that, right? So at that time, back in March, I got an email from this friend of mine, Young Zhao, who said that, like, what if schools were closed for 1 year? And at that time, I thought he was joking. I thought that, at the most, it would be a few weeks and we'd be back. But that's exactly sort of what happened. And we started this sort of similar to this one where, you have like 60 plus episodes, 68 episodes, I think now. We started this thing called Silver Lining for Learning, which you can go through silverliningforlearning.org. And essentially, March 21, 2020 was our first episode, and we have been doing this now for, in a month, it'll be 3 years. So 140 episodes, 200 plus guests from across the world. And we started off with this thing of looking at how were people responding to COVID. Now it's focused more around educational innovation. And one of the main things that we heard from everybody was a sense of disappointment that educational systems were basically not resilient for the most part. And, people were trying different things like teaching through TV or online hybrid, which is sort of what the US was. And a lot of people, there was experimentation, innovation. Nobody's questioning sort of the sort of the motivations of the educators, but there was like, it really didn't feel like, this attempt to duplicate the classroom in an online environment really worked very well. And of course, there are challenges, as we know, like issues of access. I mean, I'm working with a group in India, Quest Alliance, and one of the things that we often talk about, in fact, we just submitted a proposal. In fact, it's going in today to study first generation youth in India who've started using the internet. And so, you can imagine that if you don't have access to a smartphone or a tablet or whatever, this online learning is not going to do much for you. But the main thing that we felt is that we were sort of not even reaching the basic minimum of what education can and should be. And it's not that in education we don't know how to use technology for learning. It's just that that has not seeped into the broader sort of context in the world, right? And I want to talk about a couple of exceptions here. These are two that, people that we talked to, which was one school that my team was actually involved in designing here locally, and another one which was in San Diego Urban Discovery Schools, who were actually even when the pandemic started, dealt with it very differently than most other organizations. So the question then comes to mind is like, what was different about those organizations or schools or educational institutions who responded to the pandemic in a better way? So that's sort of the key question. And one of the things that it comes that we sort of come to realize, that it's effectively a critical role of design. And and thinking about design as how these organizations are structured. So that's an organizational design based on certain core values and principles. So I want to talk a little bit about that. And the main thing is, that to recognize that the world that we live in is like completely made up. And this is a talk I sometimes give to people who are non-designers. For all of you there, this is obvious, right? I mean, that pretty much everything that we have around us is just made up by us, right? Whether it's a teapot or like my pet dog who's sleeping here. I mean, that dog wouldn't survive one day in the wild. I mean, he has been artificially selected for certain traits and attributes which make him a wonderful pet, but pretty useless if he were out there, all by himself, right? So then when you start thinking about what else is designed, you realize that broader issues of cultures, those are all made up by us, by humans, whether intentionally or not. And so we live in a designed world. And this was one of my favorite quotes from Steve Jobs, where he says that life can be much broader once you discover one simple fact: everything around you was made up by people that were no smarter than you. And you can change it, you can influence it, you can build your own thing. So this is, I think, the mantra for all of us who see ourselves as designers, right? That the world is the way it is, and I can do something to make it better, whether it's a product or it's an organization, whatever it is, I can make it better. And so Herb Simon, who's sort of the father of sort of the design as a discipline, first book, the book that he wrote, Sciences of the Artificial, where he talks about the proper study of humankind is the science of design. That's what sets us apart from all the other species on the planet. And so when we talk about what do we mean by design, so Perkin he's an educator who brought sort of a design lens to the work. So I sort of am very influenced by his work. So he says it's structure adapted to a purpose, right? So if you are creating a poster, or you're creating a product, or you're creating an organization, or whatever you're doing, that you are creating a structure. It's an interconnected set of elements that it has to serve some purpose, right? And so in that sense, like, the question is like, who does design? As designers, we often think that we are the ones who do design, but if you ever had a class with Katie, he would show you these slides of people, truck drivers or whatever. Like, all of us are engaged in design. And so Herb Simon sort of says that everyone designs who devises courses of action aimed at changing existing situations into preferred ones. So if you are cooking, you are effectively acting as a designer, unless you are following like a scripted sort of, that you are just following a script, in which case you're not. But if you are sort of open to the materials that are there and are trying to craft a meal, that you're working as a designer. So in education, as a teacher, if you are approaching your lesson plans or whatever you want to do, you are approaching that work as a designer. And so what I have done is basically pilfered from all my sort of experience at IDC and at design, to bring what we call as a design lens to education, and to recognize that every aspect of education is made up, right? Whether it's the way we set classrooms up, admission processes, that you do a 50-minute period, then you walk from one room to the other, um, testing, credit, what have you, all these buildings that we have built, all of this stuff is made up. It's designed. And to recognize also that this educational system is producing the results it's designed to produce. Now, whether it was designed deliberately or it happened by history and happenstance, that's a different story. But if students don't enjoy school, it's because we have designed schools to be this way. We have designed school to be spaces where they feel alienated, spaces where creativity is not encouraged. So if students are not being creative, it's because we have designed the curriculum, we have designed the setup, we have designed the testing regimes and whatever, right, to be that way. If we have serious issue of access and equity, that there are some people who have access to better schooling, others who don't, that is a design problem, in the sense that we have built these systems in ways, or our society in ways that either create or maintain these disparities, right? And so as we were doing this work and thinking about some of my more recent work is around this, what we call this 5 spaces for design. And so that's sort of the talk. The theme of the talk is how can we think about the role of design within education. It builds on work by a couple of design theorists, Richard Buchanan and Tony Goldsby Smith, who took sort of a historical approach towards thinking about design. So they talk about that design evolved from things like graphic design towards industrial design as the industrial revolution happens, to the more digital spaces like interaction design, and now we are thinking in terms of systems design, so business processes and so on, that those are also designed. So we took a slightly different tack. We looked at what we call the spaces for design in education, like where does design enter into the educational process. So the way I sort of tried to explain this is actually through a story of my own life. So if you don't mind, I will talk a little bit about my own life. So I grew up in Mizoram, and what's interesting, the reason I have this picture of this cowboy over there is that kids in Mizoram could draw so well, and they loved drawing cowboys and horses. And I remember I was like 7 6 7 years old, and I would try to draw, and everybody would make fun of me because clearly I could not draw. And what's interesting is that my dad got transferred to Delhi, and there, since nobody cared about sketching and drawing, suddenly I became the artist. Everybody was like, "Oh, you should see Punya, he draws so well." And so once I got that positive thing, I started looking at the world differently. I started like looking at how people were drawing comics. And so I think the big thing that sort of now in hindsight that I realize is that talent is contextual, that my talent that people saw in Delhi, but which was laughed at in Mizoram, was not inherent to me as much as it was the world around me and relative to that. And I don't think like I would have gone to IDC, I would have done any of the stuff that I've done if my dad hadn't been transferred to New Delhi. Because if I'd have stayed in Mizoram, chances are I would have never thought of myself as having any kind of sort of visual talent whatsoever, right? And then, of course, I was like growing up, I was interested in pretty much anything and everything, like science, math, art, literature. I used to just love to read. And then I ended up going to BITS Pilani because, if you're good at science and math in India, you either become a doctor or an engineer. So I ended up going to Pilani, which I have regarded as like the worst 4 years of my life. In fact, just gave a talk about, I wrote a piece about called My Greatest Failure. And I talked about that those 4 years were just, I mean, I made friends, I learned how to drink and have a good time, but academically and sort of intellectually, most importantly, it was just not fun for me. I just did not enjoy it. I didn't feel like the way I like to play with ideas and stuff was encouraged or supported. So at the end of those 4 years, I really felt like a failure. And lucky for me, I saw a poster for IDC in the civil engineering department, and I even didn't fill out. At that time, you had to send a 40 rupees money order. I didn't even do that. One of my friends did that for me. And, ended up in IDC, getting my degree in visual communications, ended up teaching there for 1 year. And to be honest, it sort of blew my brain. Those 2 years in IDC, the plus 1 year that I taught there, just completely changed the way I look at the world, the way I think about it. I fell in love with typography, started doing funky games like this, met this gentleman, R.K. Joshi, who had this sort of sense of play, and this love for type and fonts and design, visual design sort of came from there. I remember Professor Katie coming into class one day with some cauliflower and talking to us about fractals, and his presentations. And so this is a visual design that I created for the word fractal, which is a fractal. So it's this sense of play. I still remember Katie's talk about, temple architecture and self-similarity, and so which led many, many years later to me to make this design, which is the word self-similarity, that goes on and on forever. So the long and short point is that this interest that I'd always had in education, that's why I came to IDC to make educational film. And what I was not expecting was finding this domain of design. And then I realized that I had sort of found a home and a family and a community and a history and a tradition that I could be a part of. One of the big things there was actually first time working on the Macintosh computer. There you can actually see Ravi's mustache. And there's GV and I sitting there with, I think, one of the old machines that was in his office. So I wanted to take a picture with it. And that was also transformational in its own way. This is pre-internet, pre-email. I remember Raj, you and I would be sitting in the computer lab, talking about stuff. But I sort of sensed that something interesting was going to happen in this intersection of this digital technology and education. So I ended up going to Urbana-Champaign, where I got my PhD. So there's an interesting thing here. So as I'm studying for my PhD, I find this book. One of my friends actually gives me this book called Discovering by Robert Root Bernstein. And it's a throwaway section in the book. He talks about this little piece there where he says there are 400 different representations of the periodic table of elements. And I was like, kuch bhi, I mean, we all know this is what the periodic table looks like. And so then I start sort of get obsessed and I start checking out books from the library. I start reading more about it. And I discover this universe of different representations of the periodic table. There are three-dimensional, spiral. And the point is that all of them are right, but all of them are also wrong, in the sense that even the one that we have in our textbooks is right in certain ways and misrepresents the system in other ways. And so there were two sort of key insights here, is like how much creativity chemists are showing, chemistry, people who love chemistry are showing, but we do not allow our students the same amount of creativity. We don't allow them to play with elements like with Lego blocks, which is essentially what scientists are doing. And the other thing is that there is this connection between the technology, which is the technology of print, and how we represent ideas. And that was a really powerful sort of an insight, that the reason we print that periodic table this way and not this way, sort of looking like this, is so that it can fit within the pages of a book. Now, once we move into the digital realm, suddenly things change, because you can zoom in and out, you can click, you can show different representations, you can jump between representation to see why one is better, one is worse. And so that ended up just, for a book that I just discovered, ended up becoming my PhD dissertation, where I developed this piece of software. And you can see this is this old version of Netscape back in 1996, 97. So I was running my own little server and writing my own like hand coding HTML, because there were no other tools there. This software doesn't work because none of the plugins exist anymore. But this was my dissertation, was looking at how we can look at the periodic system of elements through these different representations, right? And so that brings me to the first space that design and education intersect, which is this creation of artifacts. So artifacts are relatively stable objects that can be perceived through our senses. So a school desk, influences, if a desk is fixed to the ground, it influences how, as a teacher, you can do things in that space. If a desk is one that can be moved around, you can ask students to sit in a circle or do this or do that, right? Or it can be a piece of software and so on, right? So one of the things that as designers we create in education are artifacts. So I got my PhD and went to Michigan State University, where again, I continued this sort of work around bringing design and education together. So I used to teach these classes, which were called learning, like design as a pedagogy, and design and pedagogy, like so doing both of these things. So the whole bunch of writing that came out of that, with this idea of looking at teachers as designers. So those of you who are interested in education and design, there's a paper that's on my website where we look at different ways that design plays in sort of the timeline of what an educator does. So whether it's their education or it's the process of creating output, lesson plans, and or actually enacting them in the classroom. Back in 2004, 5, 6, my colleague Matt Kaler and I developed this framework for pedagogy, content, and technology, which got very popular. So a lot of my citations come from that. So if you look me up, most people will know me in education for this work. But that was sort of side work that happened, not because I necessarily wanted to do that as much as, thinking about new ways of having people engage and think about education, how we design these processes which can make education really powerful. And so if you look at, when you think about design, you go from artifacts, you go to processes. So that's the second space, right? So processes are everything from an admissions process to how the sequence by which you teach concepts in math, maybe. So all of those things are, again, designed. And as a designer in education, you can step in and make those better, right? But there is more than sort of just artifacts and processes. teaching and learning is about designing an experience. It is about creating an experience for students which is moving, which is engaging and powerful. So that becomes another space for design. And that's where I think creativity, beauty, and aesthetics, all of these things come in. Because as John Dewey said, that even though we know that all education comes through experience, it doesn't mean that all experience are genuinely educative, right? And so it becomes our job as educators to think about crafting these experience. And that's where sort of understanding the student, their background, understanding where they're coming from, how to create experiences which are actually engaging and open, mind opening becomes really powerful. And so I do some work around like the role of aesthetics in learning. And so this is a recent podcast episode that I did for this podcast called Beauty at Work. It's linked to on my website if you want to listen to it. I actually had a lot of fun doing this one. But now, if you contrast it to how we typically think about school or what happened during the pandemic, my daughter was doing her undergraduate degree. If she had to take an exam, there was a camera which was watching her. She'd have to show the whole room that she was not cheating. Like, think about the kind of experience that is for a student, right? Like, it starts out with the assumption that we don't trust you. So the third space that we talk about design is experiences. And that has to do with feelings and emotions as much as with the actual object or the processes. So I was at Michigan State, finally ended up at Arizona State University. We are we're one of the largest universities in the country with over 100,000 students, over 1 lakh students. And we are very proud of the fact that we are a pretty innovative place. And so we care about that so much. So we put it on every bus and hoarding that we can find in our city. And it's here in taking up this position as an associate dean where I started looking at the world in a slightly different way, because it gave me an opportunity to think of design in terms of systems and culture, and realizing that you could have the right artifacts, you could have the right processes, you could have the right trying to create the right experiences. But if your broader systems don't lead that way, none of this is going to work. That if your organization or your culture doesn't truly have that built in, none of those innovations are going to work. And so one of the questions I've always wondered, I mean, we talk about in the field, is like, why has change been so hard in education? And I think this is one reason to understand why it has been so hard, is because the broader systems and culture within which schools or higher ed exists resist that change, right? And so when we think about technology, like let's say, the cell phone, like the meaning of the cell phone is way more than just this device, right? And its connectivity. And so this, all of you will appreciate this thing, like less so now, but back in when the cell phones were first new, you had this whole missed call idea, right? Which is, call karoha, missed call. No, everybody gets that. And it turns out that at one point in Bangladesh, some 70% of the calls traffic was missed calls, but when I talk about that here, people don't understand it, because making calls here was never very expensive. So to understand, and 70% of cellular network traffic in Bangladesh at one point was missed calls. So understanding this thing called the cell phone is more than understanding that artifact, that its meaning and how we use it comes from this broader system, economic systems and cultural systems, which favor frugality in one case and not in the other, right? So that brings us to the model that I've been working towards, is what we call the 5 spaces for design. So talked about artifacts, processes, experiences, systems, and culture. And so when we look at this intersection of design and education, we see that there is this sort of process back and forth between, like, artifacts. It's not to say that systems and culture completely determine how artifacts are used, because I'll just give an example of a recent one where all of us have heard about, like, ChatGPT. And now it's like, oh, we can't have students write essays anymore. We can't have them do this. We can't have, because ChatGPT will write it for them, right? And so here is an instance where the artifact actually changes the nature of processes and experiences that we want to create for our students, right? So I'm not going to go on much longer. I'd rather have more of a conversation. But back to the question we started with, like, why did some school systems deal with COVID better than others? And it really has to do with the systems and culture within that institution, within that organization. So if something has to sustain a change in any sort of in education has to sustain, it must become part of the system and the culture. And so what we have been doing is this large co-design projects. I'm going to skip ahead a few slides if you don't mind, because I want to be sure that we have time for a conversation. So in this work that we've been doing with schools, we designed the school, which is a completely different model for what a school can be. One second. Can you see my slides?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yep. Okay. Thank you. And so Donald Shawn has been very influential in my thinking as about design. And he says, that design is what all of us do insofar as we make things out of the materials of a situation under conditions of complexity and uncertainty. And I think this idea of complexity and uncertainty is something that designers inherently understand. One of my favorite research studies by Nigel Cross, where he gave some problems, like relatively simple sort of problems in the world, to designers and non-designers. So non-designers started working on the problem, and designers would keep asking questions like, it can't be this simple. So as designers, I think our mindset is that of sort of always thinking that things are more complicated, right? Which is a good thing because the world is complicated. And I think that that's a superpower that we have. And I think that what designers bring to education, which I feel is like what IDC gave me and my further sort of reading about design and think and doing and practice of design, is that we bring a set of attitudes and mindsets to the problems. How we think and act, but sometimes we act, and then we look at what's happening and we change things accordingly. There is an openness to opportunity. People have often talked about the sort of sense of empathy for the audience, and in this case, in education, for teachers and learners, a tolerance and maybe even a love of ambiguity. Like, I know when I talk to a lot of my colleagues, I'm always the one who's much more comfortable with things being ambiguous. Like, okay, we'll figure it out. Kuch to upay nikalenge, but it's that sort of mentality that it's okay to be in the zone of not having all the answers or not even knowing what the right questions are. But it is also coupled with the sense of optimism that we can do something to make it better, and a willingness to sort of iterate. But at the end of the day, underlying all of this is a sort of a deeper sense of values that we bring to the work that we do. So in education, unless you have a genuine care for the learners, unless you have a genuine care and concern for what they need to learn, the topics that you're covering, you cannot do it. So that's a value-laden thing. And it is something that is deeper than the process of design or creativity, because design and all that don't give you those values. The values guide how you work. And understanding that when we talk about these systems of education, that it's this architecture. This is one of my favorite quotes by Alan Kay from Apple, is, as with most media from which things are built, whether a cathedral, a bacterium, a sonnet, a figure, or a word processor, architecture dominates material. And I just love that, because design is really about understanding the relationships between things, people, things, processes, so on, right? And so this is great. It says, to understand clay is not to understand the pot. What a pot is all about can be appreciated better by understanding the creators and users of the pot and the need to inform material with meaning and abstract meaning from the form. So it's that process of engagement and meaning making. That's what I think a designer brings to the educational. Another of my favorite quotes from Alan Kay, where he's talking about the difference of this, even though both are acts of design, how designing an artifact is different from designing a system, because these problems at the systems level, these are wicked problems. There will be discussion on what the problem is in the first place, right? So you can fix a clock, but in a system, you have to negotiate with the system. And I don't think many people sort of understand that once you're thinking in terms of organizations and systems, that it's not something that you can step in and fix, which is sort of the typical politician answer, right? We can make this policy and we can fix X, not realizing that it's a very complex sort of relationship between these elements. You do one thing, the system will push back another way. So to understand that. So to coming full circle, where I talked about Delhi and that this idea of talent is contextual, determined by broader systems and culture. My 4 years in Pilani, feeling like a failure, but now sort of in hindsight, realizing that I always thought that I had failed, but now I realize that it's actually the system had failed me. It took a young person who was super enthusiastic about learning and just beat that shit out of him completely for 4 years, right? That's not my fault. I was 18. That is the fault of the educational system. And so if we have to change this for the better, not just like I'm done, but for the next generations who are coming, our children, their children. So we have to understand the system and the culture and to design a better system and culture. So anyway, so this is sort of the 5 spaces. I'm going to skip this. So when I was in IDC, I created this thing called the Dictionary of Design. It's still online, so you can go look it up. That was a lot of fun. But with that, I will stop now and take some questions, comments, anything. So thank you very much. I will close this now and stop sharing.
Wow. Thank you, Punya.
Thank
That
you.
was a great talk. I mean, a lot of things which none of us were clued on. So we'll open the floor to questions. You can, Gokul, please go ahead.
Yes,
Yeah.
Punya,
Hi.
amazing, amazing. It's really enlightening to know that part of being on the other side of the desks where I've always been a student of design. I really didn't know there's so much to do to really research and recreate and improve in delivering education. Amazing work.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Proud of you.
My pleasure.
Guys, I'm sure you have a lot of questions.
Yeah, I guess you're just spellbound.
Oh,
Yes, yes.
Hi, Punya. So,
hey.
yeah, it was great to know what you have been doing so far, and some of the work is really amazing you did with the community and involving the, going beyond the institute level. Actually, that was great, and it's really eye-opening what can be done. And thank you so much for sharing your experience. Um, and it's amazing to see you again to online.
I
And
know.
we hope to meet again. Yes,
Seems
yeah,
like
it was
yesterday
great
we
to.
were starting in IDC, and now I feel like, ah, kahan gaye wo din?
Yes, and it was nice to see Raj, organizing the whole thing, and also Kirti sir. It was nice. I think I'm not seeing him now. It's I think just put a camera off, but nice to see everyone, Deepthi and all. Great to see you here.
Yeah, no,
Thank you for that.
I didn't know Katie would be at this presentation. Those slides about fractals and self-similarity. I remember that lecture. I remember him walking in with a cauliflower in his hand and like, "Ye gobi kyun leke aaya hai class mein," right? and, and that becomes a conversation about
Yeah,
self-similarity and temples. And it's been one of the most, that I think is one of the really transformational moments for me. I'd known about fractals and stuff, but sort of thinking it the way he did, I remember that very well. I mean, there are moments of RK and Ravi, and that you just remember, and that is the one that I remember. So
absolutely.
thank you, Katie,
Yes,
for that.
thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, Katie sir is here. How are you, sir?
Hi, how are you, Fatima?
Yeah, we're good. How about you? How are you doing? I'm seeing you
I'm
after so
good.
long. Yeah, nice
I'm
to see
good.
Deepthi as well. Yeah.
So, Punya, I want to ask you, it's something which has bothered me throughout the IDC, though later on everyone says it's so enjoyable, but the level of enthusiasm when you enter IDC, everybody is so excited that they finally got admitted. By the time you're in third semester, the enthusiasm tapers off, everyone skips classes and doesn't turn up, and you face the other way when you see the teacher. And I found in general, most education in India is basically very stressful. So like in IIT also, people would prefer not doing anything to going to the classes, not go to the classes, do nothing. And that was a preferable option in a class, in an institute. They worked so hard to get into. So I've been I've been thinking about this problem, how to make this less stressful, because learning
Right.
should be thoroughly enjoyable all the time. And why it tapers off even in the best of places. Have you thought about this?
Absolutely. I think that this is this is the biggest challenge I think in education is this, right? Because, and I think it's fundamentally got to do with that, the why, the purpose of education. And I think the purpose in education, at least in school level, is determined much more by adults than by the people, by the kids. Nobody asks the kids what they want to learn. They are incredibly curious. I don't think that educational BITS Pilani is a reputed institution, and I hated my 4 years there because nobody cared about why we were learning anything. Yeah, I remember in my first semester, I'm sitting in an atomic physics class and I'm writing limericks about quantum states. I mean, that's who I was. And it took, and 4 years, they just beat it out of me. Till the end of 4 years, I was like, I'm no good at anything. Mere se kuch nahi hone wala hai. Like, what the hell is kind of a system have we created, right? There is no, why should students, once they have the freedom to not go to class, why should they go to class if that class is not designed for them? That's what I'm trying to say. So they are doing absolutely the right thing by not going to classes and bunking classes, because the classes are not meaningful to them. We have not put in the effort to
Exactly
make
the
education
point.
meaningful.
Yeah, I
So
agree
they are
totally.
doing absolutely, they are the maximizers of their own self-interest. And their self-interest at this point is to sit and hang around with friends, because they're actually learning a lot through that. They're learning how to get along with people. They're having a good time. That's meaningful to them. They're also young, whatever. But those same people, if given the right context, and that's the point I was trying to make about sort of going from Mizoram to Delhi. I didn't change. That 4 months from May in 98 to August in 98, I was a different person. I hadn't changed. BITS Pilani became IDC. My life changed. I became committed. I became enthusiastic. I wanted to learn more. I was reading more. I was thinking more. Where was that fellow 4 months ago? The fault is in the way we have designed our systems. It's meaningless. We make it meaningless.
Exactly.
It's terrible.
Actually, I remember, can I make this point?
Please.
I remember I asked the whole class of students in IDC in the auditorium. So there were 100 of them. And I asked them, when was the last time you did something you wanted to do on your own? And they said, before coming to IDC. I mean, in IDC, they never got enough because they're so crammed with courses and structures and timetables and whatever. And I have a paper on it. I will share it with you. Physical infrastructure-based institutions actually should be support systems to education, but they acquire a control role. They decide, instead of being supports, they become control system.
Exactly.
Education is like a crutch. If you can walk on your own, you don't need it. You can throw it away.
Right.
But if it exists to support itself and to control every component of your life, then it simply inhibits all kind of growth, and it happens in the best of places. And that's where we are at now. We need to do better.
No, I think
so.
You're absolutely right. These become systems of control and domination rather than learning and growth. And no, absolutely. I see there's a couple of questions here in the comment. What might the negotiations entail for design educators when design is future position and systems love suboptimal stability to keep it from falling apart? So I think one of the big things, sort of my realization has been like, I created, let's say, this software program called Flips. But since that kind of exploratory learning is not necessarily recognized in schools and so on, that software just sat there. So now sort of working within this broader context of systems and recognizing exactly what you're saying, which is that it is suboptimal, that you just do the best that you can, and that it's going to be a long haul. I mean, so I have friends who in the Azim Premji Foundation who work with schools across India, and they tell me that it takes 10 years of sustained effort of being in that community, doing anything and everything you can to really start seeing the change in students' learning, in school structures and systems and so on. So the bottom line is that this stuff is not easy, right? Even the school that we designed, it's just a tiny school within a larger school district. That was 2 years of work. And I was lucky that I had some funding, that I had a team that could support that work. Usually that is not the case, but I think it's a question of time that you need to give to it. And design is always about satisficing. So the results are always going to be suboptimal. That's what means that we will always be employed. That's the good part. But it also means that you're never going to have a perfect answer. All right. So Manasi has a question. Teaching design to engineering students, experimental content and pedagogy. Manasi, I would say drop me an email. I'll send you my WhatsApp number. We can talk offline about this, because there's a lot of things we can talk about there. These are, and I have some writing on the subject that we can talk more about that. And yes, I was trying to remember more graphics. It's Chitra. Thank you, Chitra, for joining. And somebody had a raised hand, I think.
Shrikant, go ahead.
Hi, Punya. Great presentation.
Thanks.
You mentioned about, dealing with fourth order of design, right? As per the Richard Dawkins model, right? That's where you're working on. So when we kind of are moving boundaries, right? So here, now you're coming from a design background and now trying to deal with systems, right? And trying to do a systemic changes or systemic design, right? In a particular domain, let's say for education. Now, let's say somebody who's from an education background and they're trying to do similar changes without a design background, right? So essentially, the intention is same at both the ends. Right? So do you think, that's where this whole notion of design thinking been applied from a traditional, moving away from a traditional disciplines of design. So do you see these things kind of are kind of moving in a different direction, or different people acquiring, let's say there are so many educationists, they're trying to improve education system, for example, right?
Sure.
So do you see like a designer getting into a domain versus a domain experts getting into design?
That's a great point. And I'm the example of like somebody coming from design into education, right? But I think that the reverse is more often true in educational fields. And in some ways, a big part of my role, in some ways, particularly when I'm working with teachers, is to get them to see themselves as designers.
Okay.
There is a sense of liberation that comes from realizing that all of this stuff is made up and we can remake it, that one can bring a design mindset to it. And so for me, I don't like the phrase design thinking, because I think it's gotten co-opted into like five circles and nonsense, right? Because designers work in very complicated ways. And in fact, I have a paper presentation which is called Why Design Thinking Sucks in Education, right? Because in education, if you follow that model, you actually sometimes turn away educators, because if you start with empathy, teachers get really pissed off at you because they are born empathetic. They wouldn't become a teacher. And so if you go and now finger wag them and tell them you should empathize with your students, they're like, screw you, guy, kya? You think I don't? Right? So you can't start with that. You have to start somewhere else. So forget design thinking. But yes, I think you're absolutely right. So part of my job in some ways is getting those people who don't see themselves as designers to recognize that they have been doing design all along.
Okay.
Right? One. And two, that there are tools and techniques and approaches and mindsets that you can bring from this field, which can change how you do your work.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. So it's basically, now people are talking about changing designers' role from creator to facilitator, right?
Absolutely. So once, and this I think goes back to Chitra's question in the beginning, that when you're working with systems, that was the Alan Kay quote, which is that you negotiate with systems, right? So my job in the school design, my only job was continuously telling people, don't worry, ho jayega, meeting cancel ho gaya, no problem. next week milte hain, they haven't replied to email, fir se email bhejo, main call. That was my job. But I realized in hindsight that that was design. I was engaged in design, but in a very different way than when I was making a piece of software. Right? But it was still a designer's role. But it's negotiation. It's non-stop negotiation. So I think there was another hand up.
Yeah. Agnishika?
Thanks, Srikanth, for the
Yeah,
question.
hi, Dr. Mishra.
Hi.
It was a really great talk. I missed the first 10 minutes, so I don't know if I missed this. But the question I had was, given what you're proposing, what are your thoughts on assessment? Because, I mean, we're on the continuum between complete self-assessment or ungrading to completely controlled and current kind of practices of assessment. Where are you located there?
So, one of these things is, people often talk about, they say, like, teachers teach to the tests, and as if that's a bad thing. It's not a bad thing. Like, what else would you teach toward? You have to teach towards some form of assessment. Clearly, assessment is critical, right? But just as when, you take a driving exam, the test is about driving. You don't take a multiple choice exam and then they put you in a car and make you drive, right? So I think the role of assessment, you have to think about, coming back to Katie's original thing, like, what is the purpose of the schooling in this education? And that purpose will determine the kinds of assessment that you need. I think ungrading works really well in certain contexts in higher ed. Not sure it works in every context. So I'm not one to say that all assessment is a problem. No, assessments have to be there. We do that all the time. But I think if assessments drive the entire pedagogy, like entrance exams or these 12th board exams or APA, whatever have you, if they drive everything, that becomes a problem. So my thing would be all of the above. There's a place where, standardized test can make sense. Nobody's saying, I'm not saying that it's not, but if we just keep everything to that, then that's a problem. I hope that, I don't know if that
it's a good answer, but I don't know if, what do you do with your what did you do with your last course, for instance?
Oh, last course, for instance, I had my students. So this was a course about education and design. So I had students from the design school, I had students from the College of Education. And I took this 5-frame, this model that I talked about. And for artifacts, I had them do a photo essay about people's relationship with things. For processes and experiences, I had them do an analysis of a podcast series. So it was different things, and finally culminating in one large project around sort of the future of education and technology, right? So no, class exams, no standardized tests, really project-based. I'm a great believer in project-based learning because I think hands-on plus reflection. I think lots of people do hands-on but don't do the reflection piece is really the best way to go. So that was what I did.
Great. Thank you so much.
Of course.
Hi, Punya. Yeah, just continuing that particular line of thought. I mean, it's the kind of testing would be very contextual in terms of, I mean, if you're doing it at a master's level or if you're doing it at a professional level, then a project kind of a thing would be the right way to go. I mean, you can't probably give them MCQs and say, okay, what are that particular line or fill in the blanks kind of a thing. There you would really try to evaluate for you and for themselves how much they have picked up and they're able to, bring forward. But yeah, at a board level, at the 10th board or the 12th board, that kind of level, yes, you need to have definitely like focused question answers kind of a thing.
I don't know. I mean, do we? I don't know. I mean, if you think of the number of kids that drop out or feel horrible about themselves, don't feel that they can learn, I mean, growing and developing for so much in our life, and to build this high stakes thing when you're like 15, 16 years old, I mean, I get it, that's the system, but I don't necessarily think it's a good system. I don't necessarily think it's a just and equitable system. I think it advantages privileged people huge amount. I mean, that's one thing I didn't talk about, is like how privileged I was to have a family which could afford to send me to BITS Pilani, who could afford to then send me to IIT, who had money to get me books and this and that, right? And that's something that, we always put like our success to our hard work. Very more often than not, we have been given a huge foot up in life compared to other people. And so I don't think that these exams that we have them the way we have them now are fair. Because the underlying setup is not fair. So, I mean, yeah, I understand that, when you're doing it at scale and so on, this seems like the easy way out. I get it, but I also feel that there can be other possibilities that we can at least discuss and talk about, and as educational designers, try to change.
Yeah, cool. That's fair enough in terms of what are the possibilities. Definitely.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. Shikant, please go ahead.
Yeah. Just a follow-up question from the earlier one. So when you're dealing with, let's say, the role is changing, right? When you're dealing with system kind of a stuff. So do you see like the craft of a code, craft of a designer changing somewhere else from what the craft skills originally was thought to be of design?
So thank you for that question again. It's a very good question. So
Yeah.
I think it goes back to the point you had made earlier about that there is a deep knowledge of content of a certain domain that you need to have to be a designer in that domain, right? So a graphic designer and a product designer both are making artifacts, but the kinds of knowledge that they have are very different. And so I think, so this is we put this label of design across all of these things, like what holds it together. And I think that's why that Simon quote resonates with me, right? Because that Simon quote is like as basic as it can be, interested in taking existing situation, make it preferred ones. That's anybody. I have a poster of this kid spitting out his food that his mom is giving him. And I said, this kid is a designer because he's going from an existing situation to a preferred situation, which he doesn't want to eat the Karela. I was sort of half making a joke there. But coming back to your point, that I think the kinds of knowledge to negotiate in this thing is very different. It's a people knowledge. It is an understanding of people's motivations, trying to tap into their best instincts. There is a little bit of manipulation involved, to be absolutely honest, to get things, so it is a very different kind of knowledge than anything that I had done before. So I've had to learn a lot or tap into that aspect of understanding motivations and then how you create processes that make people a certain way. It's a different kind of knowledge, absolutely.
It requires a different kind of skill set. Yeah,
it is a different skill set, and I think it sort of comes with age. I see some people have that early, but that's one I think that it needs you to be kicked around a little bit in life before you sort of get it. So there's a question from Sahana here on teaching design in school. I think that a design mindset or perspective needs to be taught from very early on. Nigel Cross, I think, has this sort of table, or I don't know if it's Cross or whoever, where they look at sort of scientific ways of looking at the world, artistic ways of looking at the world, and designerly ways of looking at the world. So I think that's a really powerful form of knowledge. I'm not sure whether it'll help in a future design college education or not. That's not the point. I think that all of us need to have some understanding of this built world that we live in. And when I say built world, I mean everything from objects and artifacts to systems and processes, right? We just don't see it that way. So I would love for sort of a design curriculum to be part of the school from first grade. Why just 11th and 12th? And it doesn't have to be its own course. It could be a part of how we do science, how we do other things or projects and so on. But I would love to see that. I think that'd be very cool. I think there are some places which are actually taking that perspective in schools. Thanks, Pratima. Good to see you. Thanks for joining.
Did we answer Sahana's question? I think there's some question here.
Yeah, I did.
Oh, yeah, okay, fine.
Yeah.
Sorry, I missed it.
No, that's okay. Yeah, I'm just looking at the time. I'll have to hop off at the hour. I'm sorry.
Okay, then there are no more questions. We would like to thank Punya again for all that time spent, lovely discussions, and in that introduction, Punya's website link is given, so you can follow up with him. If you need contact, he's there in the group, or just message me.
I can drop my email address here.
Yeah. Okay. So thank you very much, and good night. And I'm just going to stop the recording right now.
Right.
Anybody
Good
wants to
night.
hang up?
Yeah.
All right.
Thank you
Punya.
guys very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you so much. Absolute pleasure and honor. Thanks for inviting me.
Punya. Thank you.
Hi, Deepti.